On the border between France and Belgium, the Ardennes forest is a relic of the vast woodlands which once covered much of medieval Europe. It is still home to what has been claimed is the oldest surviving breed of horse in Europe, the Ardennes heavy horse. Nearly 900 years ago, the men and horses of the Ardennes embarked on the boldest adventure in Christendom. They joined the 4,000-mile march to Jerusalem to liberate the holy places from the hands of the infidel. The harrowing experience of the journey is all but forgotten, though its success was to affect the lives of nearly every family in Europe, for it was shared by ordinary men, women, and children, as well as soldiers and great lords.
For 20 years, I've wanted to make a land voyage in a medieval fashion. And that meant by doing by horseback, and an important journey, the journey that in fact was made by thousands and thousands of people, and the great Crusade journey, but the Crusade land journey particularly. And it was only made once, and it was only made by one, in the sense of once successfully, by one successful army, and it was the first time it was done.
For centuries, devout pilgrims from all over Europe had made the long and dangerous journey to the tomb of Christ, the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. But by 1096, the path south from Constantinople was closed by Turkish invaders. To a society where faith bordered on fanaticism, this disruption was a challenge that could not be ignored. Preaching to an audience who believed that earthly sacrifice was a guarantee of heavenly reward, the Pope called for an armed pilgrimage to capture Jerusalem. It was an idea of immense appeal to a violent and self-confident society. Within weeks, Europe began to muster armies for the Crusade. One army gathered under the banner of Godfrey de Bouillon, Duke of Lorraine and Lord of Ardennes, whose father had fought at Hastings under William the Conqueror.
Duke Godfrey became the hero of chivalry, and he conforms to the pattern that I've always followed, which is to investigate men who've travelled and whose journeys have become the stuff of legend. And Duke Godfrey is precisely that. He became the hero of chivalry. He was the perfect knight.
Today, the descendants of the medieval battle horses, each animal weighing as much as a ton when fully grown, are bred for show, for forest work, or, as often as not, for meat.
When I first came to do my research here, I was obviously interested in the technology of travel, what sort of horses, saddles, the others they should use. And I observed that right around this area is raised a native horse to this area called the Ardennes horse. Massive, ideal pack animal, ideal heavy charger in battle that could carry a fully armed man. The Ardennes horse. The one that I've got, he's called Carty. He's very intelligent, but he's also rather young. He's just a 5-year-old, though he's already got a tremendous character. With the heavy horse, there's a smaller horse, a mare called Mystery, which has been trekking, so is very accustomed to long-distance travel. Carty was totally untrained when I got him, so to help school him and to accompany me on the journey, I recruited Sarah, who's very experienced in horse handling.
It was actually something I had always thought would be a superb thing to do, and the opportunity of travelling on a journey by horseback across Europe was really something you couldn't turn down.
The 2nd of May, Tim and Sarah lead their horses out of Chateaubriand with an escort of local riders to guide them through the first few miles of forest.
I calculated that the total journey would be about 4,000 miles, or 8 months in the saddle, and that everything would depend upon the continuing health of the horses. nobody really has examined the possibilities of how it was to travel on horses over such an immense distance. And even in its own time, this was an extraordinary voyage. The people who were involved were going to be away, as it turned out, for 4 years. Many of the people who left on that journey knew that they would never come back.
Compared to Tim and Sarah's modest little expedition, Duke Godfrey's marching column would have seemed unwieldy and immense. No one knows the exact numbers involved, but it is estimated that up to 1,000 mounted knights followed the noble duke, plus 5 or 6 times that number of foot soldiers. But most of the column were civilians, ordinary men, women and children, hoping to reach Jerusalem under armed escort. They would make a great, clumsy train which straggled for miles across the countryside. Retracing the route that Duke Godfrey's army had travelled 900 years before them, Tim and Sarah follow the old Roman road across Germany and into Austria.
Riding across Austria was very pleasant. It would really equate to going on a 20-mile trek every day.
As Godfrey and his army crossed Austria, 2 other Crusader armies were also on the move. They had chosen to travel by separate paths, one through Italy, the other through Yugoslavia. The master plan was that all 3 armies would rendezvous at Constantinople in midwinter.
By the time we got to Austria, even though I had tried out different saddles, I discovered why the crusading knight preferred to use his heavy horse as a pack animal and actually ride on a light horse called a palfrey. Riding a heavy horse is purgatory. Carty pounded with his feet, and every time he slammed down a hoof, you could feel it right up through your spine.
Tim, I think, had learnt his lesson. It was excruciating to ride Carty for so many hours, repetitively day after day, and I certainly was not volunteering to exchange places with him. It was obvious that we were going to have to buy a 3rd horse as a riding horse.
By the end of June, and after 700 miles on the road, Tim and Sarah leave Austria and enter Hungary. Like Godfrey before them, they find that the land of the Magyars has a well-deserved reputation for hospitality.
One of the immediate problems for the ordinary pilgrim crusader must have been how to communicate with the locals to obtain food or shelter. Ein dritte Pferde kaufen. Und dann die große Pferde für das Gepäck. Nur die Gepäck mit der großen Pferde.
Hungarian was impossible. It was very difficult. Very few words had less than 14 letters, except horse. That was just a 2-letter word.
Low is... It's okay? Yeah?
És a lovat megeszik szinte. Nagyon szeretik csípni őket, csípik a lovat.
For the horses, food? Have you given?
Ennivalót adunk neki.
Yes?
Itt nézik a sok bagocs, meg ilyen szúnyogok, rengeteg van.
But sign language is the only way to do
You're
it.
much better at that.
Yeah, okay.
Van.
At what time? 6?
Aye.
Ez 6 éves.
Yeah. 6 o'clock?
6 éves.
Hot heavy.
That's half 6.
Half 6. I don't believe it.
Ez 6 éves. Az meg 7.
Yeah. Okay. Where are you learning Hungarian from?
Oh, you pick it up.
Oh,
Right.
The Shikos, the Hungarian horse wranglers, are among the most spectacular riders in the world. With its long tradition of horsemanship, Hungary is still a land where large numbers of horses are reared for export. The ranch at Charlopuszta is an ideal place to look for another riding horse, so that Carty can take on his medieval role as a pack animal and Tim is spared the agony of riding him.
Hungary was a very good place to choose the third horse. We tried a few different animals, one being a stallion, which was not really suitable, and one horse we spotted, they actually didn't really want to sell this horse because it was one that they used on the farm for rounding up the horses, and he was ideal. Frankly, temperament has a lot to do with it. You need a good-tempered, easy-going horse. Also, the other essential physical aspects were good legs, very good hooves. Unfortunately, Sarcher had quite flat hooves, but as long as the legs are healthy and the hooves are healthy, and a good strong back.
As soon as we'd acquired Sarcher, we had to get new shoes fitted to him. The Crusaders' horses travelled on relatively soft tracks, so they didn't have the problem we faced with shoes wearing out every 3 weeks or so on metalled roads.
I'm surprised it doesn't make the horse just lie on its back, put its feet in the air.
Diese Hut ist sehr schwer, 1 Kilo. Aber mit der Straße, 3 Wochen, finish.
For Carty, we had brought along special shoes because his feet were so big, and the size and weight of his 9-inch shoes caused universal amazement.
Carty, of course, makes it clear that he is a reluctant pack horse. Only 5 years old, he weighs nearly a ton. On the medieval battlefield, no foot soldier could possibly have withstood the mass charge of his ancestors, the war horses ridden by their armoured knights. They would have been the main battle tanks of medieval warfare. The Crusaders' route now led across the Bulgarian countryside, through the frontier provinces of the Byzantine Empire. Within a natural amphitheatre in the Rozon Mountains, the annual folk festival celebrates a culture as distinct from modern-day Western Europe as medieval Byzantium must have seemed for the Crusaders. The Crusaders were now within a powerful and wealthy empire, which greeted them with suspicion. Godfrey's march was policed by the emperor's troops.
When they entered Byzantine territory, suddenly they came to a Christian world, but one which is very alien in all its outward aspects. This was their first real contact with the Eastern Church, and that would have been a shock, because they'd have seen churches that looked entirely different, adorned inside with frescoes that were very different, and there would have been points of detail that would have shocked them. For example, under the Orthodox Church, a village priest was actually required to be married. the Crusaders were sure to have at least visited the monasteries. And after all, it was unavoidable that they would have at least encountered the hierarchy of the Eastern Church. You have to describe the three qualities necessary for a crusader. A modern crusader and an old crusader.
Един съвременен и древен кръстоносец.
The first is to have a good knowledge of horses.
Първото е да познаваш добре конете.
The second is to learn languages quickly.
Второто бързо да научаваш езиците, да се справиш всяка ситуация във всяка страна с езиците.
And the third is to have a love of alcohol.
Третото добре да се справиш и с алкохола.
These are the qualities for the modern crusaders?
And I think the historical crusaders.
Mystery and Sarcho have become almost inseparable, whereas Carty would quite happily amble off alone. I suppose the horses depend upon one another in that way because their environment is changing every day. Sarcho we've always regarded as the noble gentleman of the group, whereas Mystery is really very simple and fickle-minded. I mean, I've always said she'll walk until one of her feet drops off, and probably after. But Carty is probably the most intelligent. He constantly needs to be watched like a child. He really does thrive on a lot of human attention and is not really interested in the other two horses.
With an escort of troops sent by the Byzantine Emperor Alexius, the Crusaders marched on to the great city of Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul.
Godfrey must have known about Constantinople. It was the greatest city of his day, fabulously wealthy, capital of the Byzantine Empire, more than 1 million inhabitants. It was larger than any city in Europe. Duke Godfrey's army, which were the first major army group to arrive, and they had to spend a very cold, wet, miserable winter in tents on the other side of the Bosphorus. The ruler of Constantinople, the Emperor Alexius, decided very wisely that he was not going to let the Crusaders into the city, where they could run riot and perhaps pillage and sack the city. And as each army arrived from Europe, the Emperor made sure that the previous army was shifted across into Asia so that he didn't have the massed crusade, the massed First Crusades, sitting outside Constantinople. From Constantinople, the crusade moved on into Asia, and for the first time into enemy territory.
With temperatures in the high 30s, Carty's packs are abandoned to make his life easier. As Tim and Sarah ride deeper into Anatolia, they encounter the unchanging lifestyle of rural Turkey. Here, the people are direct descendants of the nomad tribes from Central Asia who, by Duke Godfrey's time, had claimed the interior plateau of Turkey as their own.
To suddenly arrive in a village, it causes such a commotion. The sight of Kati, who is at least 10 times larger than any four-legged beast they have. It takes some persuasion to convince the locals that this animal is in fact a horse.
To retrace Godfrey's route, Tim must still follow the ancient Roman road and the caravan trails. But each sector must be carefully checked against the early maps, because many villages have changed their names, and often the local elders are the best source of information. The Crusade's first challenge was the important walled city of Nicaea, which had only recently fallen into the hands of the Turks. The Crusaders were determined to recapture it.
Nicaea still is one of the most impressive cities. It's completely walled in. It doesn't seem to have really grown outside its walls. And the crusading armies didn't actually seem to have enough men to surround the city. Now, one of the accounts say that there were actually 600,000 people in this army. There couldn't have been, because 600,000 would have easily enveloped the city. They attacked the walls with all the military hardware of the time, and in fact, one of the chroniclers, who was a priest, was obviously rather fascinated by all the sort of gadgets involved, like the machines for throwing heavy rocks, catapults for hurling in heavy spears, the way that you would bring up a tortoise-like machine to the wall with men inside it, and they would scrabble away and remove the lower wall. On the inside, the defenders were very adept at building up the wall. In fact, there's one quite good example. The timing went wrong. They dug the hole, and the wall crashed down just in the evening when they couldn't attack in the dark. And when the dawn came up, they discovered that the wall had been rebuilt by the defense. The strength of these walls essentially held up the Christian attack. They couldn't starve the place out because the lake of Nicaea comes right up to the walls. The Turks were bringing in supplies the whole time. So the Crusaders asked the emperor to send them boats. And as soon as the city was completely sealed in, then the Byzantines were in touch with the Turkish defense, and they said, "You don't stand a chance now. Capitulate. And we won't destroy the city. It will just pass back into Byzantine control." And the Crusaders woke up one morning to see the emperor's flags flying over the city. They had not been informed that this was going on. And so there they'd been 7 weeks besieging this place. They'd had heavy losses. And at the end of it all, the emperor had his city back, and they had very, very little.
Riding onward from Nicaea, the heat and dust become daily more oppressive.
At this time of year, normally, where Kati would be the onset of winter, and his winter coat is already forming. It's like taking an elephant through the Sahara. He's not cut out for this part of the world. He's 1,000 or more miles from home. And naturally, we are very worried that he really is suffering unnecessarily, and we really have to ask ourselves the point of him continuing much further.
Dana, go on, Dana. Dana.
September. Tim and Sarah are 200 miles beyond Istanbul, the end of Godfrey's first season's march. Yet, with winter approaching, it is still vital to maintain an average of 20 miles a day while the fine weather lasts. Ahead is the main road to Eskişehir, the ancient city of Dorilaeum.
Well, it was very sudden. I wasn't really paying attention, and obviously neither was Sacho. And 1 minute I was sort of looking around thinking what lovely countryside it was, and then he totally slipped on the road surface, fell down on his side, on my leg.
So it's down the crossroads and turn left. Fine, I'll ride the horses down.
You will.
Could you take the blue bucket into town and get some ice?
Ice, sure.
Ice and, you know, Sarah will stay in the car and it's got a big lot of ice and she can put a foot in the bucket. Okay,
Sure.
now I'll ride the horse.
Next day, with Sarah in hospital, Tim is forced to ride on alone.
There was one consolation to the fact that Sarah had broken her foot. With Kati suffering more and more from heat, I'd already asked Turkish friends to look for a farm where we could leave the animals for the winter. Sarah's injury now made that winter layover inevitable.
Leaving Nicaea, the Crusaders advanced deeper into Anatolia, and at Dorilaeum found the main Turkish army waiting in ambush for them.
It was somewhere here that the Crusader army fought its great battle, the one major battle in Turkey that was a field engagement. The first army group encamped by a marsh, and it seemed that they were surprised by the Turkish attack. They were encircled. The Turks actually got right into the camp and started massacring the women and the children. The priests were praying for salvation, and they thought literally their last hour had come. But the Crusaders at that moment had managed to get a message through to Duke Godfrey and the second part of the army, which was about 2 miles away. And they spread out and they rode over the hills and they took the Turks in the rear and the flank with the charge of the Frankish knights. And that completely surprised the Turks. It was the first time that the Turks had been treated to this particular military tactic, and they simply couldn't stand up to that massive charge. It cleared the path. The Turks didn't really put up any more serious resistance all the way through to the Mediterranean coast.
Yulaf yulaf yiyorlar. At yulaf.
Ramsey, the farmer who had agreed to take in the horses until the following spring, was a retired jockey, so we knew that we were leaving the horses in safe hands.
Mystery, Sacho,
Saço.
Knowing that next year's riding will be even more grueling, Tim had decided that Kati should finish his journey here and retire with honor to a farm in Austria. While the winter snow makes riding impossible in Anatolia, the horses will recuperate. After traveling more than 2,000 miles of the Crusader Trail, they deserve 6 months of rest and good feeding.
Talebelerden yok ha? Söyler bizim ya. Salih. Biliyor mu İbrahim?
Şimdi çok büyük. Biz lazım küçük.
Küçülecek.
Ya küçük.
Umarım küçüğü var mı sizde?
Spring the following year. The moonscape of Cappadocia, central Anatolia. Here, generations of Christians have used the strange eroded pillars of rock to create homes and chapels.
There's something very strange about these dwellings. They're like anthills, and the monks have burrowed out their homes and their chapels and their graves even. They're buried in trenches carved out of the living rock. This rock-cut chapel, Christian chapel, just about 4 kilometers away from the Crusader route, may in fact explain or possibly provide an answer for one of the great puzzles of the Crusader journey. Because what had happened was that about 40 or 50 kilometers south of here, the main army, led by Godfrey and the other knights, instead of taking the direct route down towards the coast of Turkey to the Aegean and following the logical path, had turned north. And essentially what was going to happen was they were going to double their distance of travel before they could get down to Antioch. Nobody knows why they did this. It may be because they had heard about the Christian communities who lived in this area of Cappadocia. Communities which existed at the time of the Crusade and which the Crusaders may have thought could help them. And so instead of risking the great mountain barrier, they came north hoping to find friendly inhabitants, but they didn't. In fact, it was a disastrous mistake.
The Crusade journey resumes. Sarah has recovered from her injury, and to replace Kati, Tim has purchased a Turkish pack pony, Zippy. When the Crusaders crossed Anatolia, they found the land devastated. The retreating Turks had destroyed the crops and blocked the wells. Thousands of the ordinary pilgrims, as well as the horses of the knights, died of heat and starvation. Even today, in the vastness of Anatolia, human settlement is very sparse, and strangers are rare. Often Tim and Sarah found only isolated farms and herds of animals guarded by half-wild dogs.
Mystery shorter, so she can't get her feet into that.
Oh yeah, I took them quite short.
Come on, come back. Come on.
As they crossed the Central Highlands in mid-May, the night temperatures dropped close to freezing point.
Last year we worked more on a basis of going from village to village, and this year we seem to travel a lot more independently, and we're very much just a group together. I mean, we might travel maybe for 2 days without really coming into contact with other people, which I suppose puts a strain on all of us.
villages are few, so they must carry everything with them, including at least 3 days' ration of food for the all-important horses. Tim and Sarah have now covered 3,000 miles on horseback since leaving Chateaubriand. Jerusalem lies another 1,000 miles ahead. But, like the Crusaders, the toughest part of the journey still remains: the crossing of the Anti-Taurus Mountains. First, the city of Kayseri.
The city of Kayseri, besides being on Duke Godfrey's original route, was a chance to see a last vestige of the Armenian Christians, a sect which had flourished there at the time of the First Crusade. Their decaying church in Kayseri, with a congregation of just one man and one old woman, is now the last functioning Armenian church in all of central Turkey.
Eski kitap? Çok eski. Elle.
Papa hepimize birer tane hepimize verir.
İstanbul'dan geliyor.
İstanbul'dan. İstanbul'dan.
Arabaya koy. Arabaya koy.
Araba? Evet, evet.
Tuvalete falan girme bununla. Günah.
Buna.
Bundan istemem.
Get it more thoughtful when you were buying it. Feeling too there as well.
From Kayseri, the Crusaders turned east and tried to find a way through the 12,000-foot-high wall of the Anti-Taurus Mountains.
So far this year I've been constantly ill and last year we spent all our time trying to keep the horses healthy, and this year I've been far more preoccupied with my own health. I don't know what I have, but it was like every disease in the traveller's guidebook. If you're not healthy, you cannot possibly ride the distance we do, which is 40 to 50 kilometers a day.
Traveling with horses in the remoter parts of Turkey means that Tim and Sarah must rely entirely on villagers for fodder for the horses, supplies, and often shelter.
When we traveled in Turkey, we were 90% of the time at least dependent on the people that we met to house us and the horses and feed us. They were all very generous, want to do their best, but I'm sure I was extremely unkind or gracious in places because I just had enough. I didn't want to be in that position where I had to depend on them, and as much as I loved it, there were days when I just wanted to get the hell out of it.
The strain of constant travel is taking its toll on Zippy too. A swelling has begun to appear on his back, but there are no vets, and Tim and Sarah must look after him themselves as they move onward.
We were now faced with the crossing of the Anti-Taurus Mountains, the major mountain barrier of our entire journey. Zippy's back was puffy and swollen,
and I was worried that if it got any worse we would find no shelter for him among the primitive hill villages or the nomads of the uplands.
With the summer heat, Hatay nomads move north from the Syrian border to graze their flocks on the mountain pastures of the Anti-Taurus. The Hatay nomads are virtually self-sufficient. They live and trade by their sheep and goats, buying only clothes and fuel from the village traders. Each year, the same family will reoccupy its stone hut high in the mountains. In a misguided attempt to avoid the mountain barrier confronting them, the Crusaders made a disastrous diversion which left them to tackle the high passes of the Anti-Taurus range.
To this point, we've been following the old Roman road, exactly the same road as Godfrey de Bouillon's army followed. We see beside the road the columns that used to be the milestones along it. And at times you really wonder, going through, say, a very narrow river gorge, you begin to wonder whether there actually could have been a road there, and then you come across one of these columns.
I had promised an archaeologist to make a note of the inscriptions on the main roadside columns which we encountered, and the easiest way was to take a rubbing using a cotton cloth torn from a sleeping bag liner and homemade charcoal.
There were a number of times when I actually did think of stopping, and I knew really deep down that I wouldn't, because I would never forgive myself for not pushing myself to the end. But nonetheless, it required a physical and mental push to continue. There was little one could do about the situation. You couldn't exactly slip off to an airport or a train station. You really were in a very obscure part of the world, and you'd ridden yourself into a situation from which there was no escape except to continue.
Looks great when you see it. Home archaeology, Blue Peter stuff. The striking thing is how difficult it is to get through these mountains. We've been walking in and out of the water, scrambling up and down banks, and it's heavy going, very, very narrow ways. Undoubtedly, the First Crusade's army was strung out in a long, long snake going through these mountains. And they finished up by taking a very narrow pass, apparently along the side of a precipice. And it said that there was raining and muddy, and the horses slipped, and pack animals would fall over. And when one animal slipped over the edge, it would pull another one down with it. And even the knights themselves were in such dire straits that they were reduced to offering to sell their armour for just a few pence, just to get rid of the weight. And this was armour which had cost them an enormous sum to purchase way back in Europe. Now it was merely an encumbrance. This was the worst section of mountain travel that they had, and the army obviously lost a lot of its animals and a lot of its equipment.
With the final mountain peaks ahead, Tim and Sarah search for the same pass that the Crusaders used as they crossed what they bitterly called the Mountain of the Devil. Here, many of the remaining horses the Crusaders had brought from Europe fell to their deaths. Sarah and Tim turned to the mountain nomads for help.
Zippy's swollen back was not getting any better, and I wondered if the pack saddle could be made to fit him more comfortably. The mountain nomads constantly use pack ponies, so I took the chance to get what I hoped was expert advice.
Atladılar mı?
Good boy.
The nomads' reshaping of the pack saddle had not helped the problem of Zippy's swollen withers. The swelling had broken and now needed cleaning and dressing every 3 or 4 hours to help him.
Zippy had been suffering from a deep-seated abscess. With the wound now open, Tim was forced to take on the role of vet and treat Zippy's serious condition with the small stock of antibiotics they had been able to carry with them. Zippy's open wound means that for the time being, he cannot be used as a pack animal. There is no choice but to abandon much of the equipment in the scramble over the final pass.
Come on, Missy. Come on, good girl. Come on. Good. Through the gap there.